So, what a day. I mean, a lot of information. This is maybe my favorite panel I've been like very excited about. It's about healthcare middlemen. You know, I mean, I don't know how much we'll be able to talk about exactly specific ones, but it's not just PBMs. A lot of people look at PBMs not as, oh, you this entity that extracts rent and it's unclear what you actually do. A lot of people see that as extremely profitable and lucrative and a good business model. And so it's been emulated throughout the healthcare system to some extent. I mean, and so I think this is a great opportunity to talk about the other middlemen in the healthcare system. And quickly, I want to go through our speakers and introduce them. I'll start with Dr. Marco Fernandez, an anesthesiologist, as well as president of Midwest Anesthesia Partners and the Association for Independent Medicine. Next, we have Matt Lavin. He is a healthcare and commercial litigation partner in Arnold Golden Gregory's Washington, D.C. office and an incredible expert on middlemen, sort of the PBMs of the provider side of things. Third, we have Dr. Marian Mass, who is co-founder of Practicing Physicians of America and Free to Care. Dr. Mass has also worked. Is it Mass or Mass? Sorry.
Mass, just
Mass.
like Catholic Church.
Has also worked as pediatrician in suburban Philadelphia for 24 years, serving in the hospital, newborn unit, emergency room, primary care, and urgent care settings. I might have some questions for you. I have 3 small children. Might need to get your advice on a few things. Next, we have Misha Sharp from the 32BJ Health Fund, where she has launched the campaign for affordable hospitals. Previously, she worked with the United Hospital Fund to provide strategic guidance and research for the New York State Medicaid program. And finally, we have Philip Zweig from Physicians Against Drug Shortages, a grassroots patients advocacy group whose goal is to end the chronic, unprecedented generic drug shortages by restoring integrity and market competition to the generic prescription drug and hospital group purchasing industries. So we've got a lot of, we're gonna have, by nature of this, we're gonna have to jump around. I don't even know. This is gonna be a bit of a game. I'm not even sure what people are allowed to talk about, not allowed to talk about specifics. But let's start with I think the middleman that to me is basically like the PBM, but of the providers, which is the Multiplan, the Navigard, the sort of like billing intermediary that sort of is associated with insurers, but negotiating on behalf of them against providers is tangentially related to the surprise billing and things like that. Matt, if you wouldn't mind, this is one of my favorite topics. Would love to hear your thoughts on just the state of play, where we are in this world, and am I right to be talking about these middlemen this way?
Yeah, I think it's an important issue because they're kind of like a hidden force in healthcare reimbursement that doesn't get a lot of attention. And because they kind of operate in the shadows, they get away with a lot, and they kind of exercise, I think, outside influence and pressure on how healthcare claims are paid to physicians in this country. So Multiplan, for anybody that's not familiar with Multiplan originally was a company that for a long time, and they worked with traditionally out-of-network payments. So, a United Healthcare or an Aetna or a Cigna, 90% of the claims they pay every day are in-network claims subject to a contract with a healthcare provider. And Multiplan kind of stepped in, and their role was to price the out-of-network claims. And the way that they did that kind of historically was they would go around and get their own contracts with physicians and hospitals, facilities, other healthcare providers, and they would essentially rent those contracts to the big insurance companies. So if you went to go see a provider and that provider was out of network with your insurance, It's possible that that provider has a contract with Multiplan, and you'd be under that contract, and that would be kind of the provider would accept somewhat reduced reimbursements under their billed charges, but they usually get paid pretty good. And the benefit to the insurance company was the insurance company could say, look at this great network we have. We have not only the people that we're in network with, we also work with this partner. And that was their model for a long time. But over the last 10 or so years, they've really gotten into what are called, aggressive cost containment pricing strategies. And those take a lot of different forms. And basically what they are different versions, typically of reference-based pricing, where they won't tell anybody how they're pricing those claims. And there's a kind of a black box. And the provider may think, oh, it's Multiplan. I have a contract with Multiplan. I'm going to get paid pretty well on this claim. But in reality, that claim is being priced at pennies on the dollar using one of Multiplan's aggressive cost containment tools, or possibly a negotiation process that they use. And, they're getting underpaid, by huge percentages, such that it's very difficult these days for providers who are not in network with everybody to, maintain their level of reimbursements. Multiplans become very wealthy and successful doing that. They went public a few years ago. And basically what they do is they get paid a percentage of the underpayment. So there's a huge incentive for them to pay that claim as low as possible, because the larger the underpayment, the bigger the delta between the provider's billed charge and the underpayment, the more they get paid. I've been involved in probably at least 24 cases against. So my thing is, I'm a provider side healthcare reimbursement attorney. So I represent only healthcare providers in reimbursement cases against payers, usually commercial payers. And often Multiplan is part of that equation on those reimbursements. So there's been a number of cases against them. And right now, in fact, there is one of the largest, what I think is going to become one of the largest healthcare cases in the country is antitrust litigation and antitrust multi-district litigation currently in Northern District of Illinois, involving Multiplan and all of the largest healthcare payers in this country, which alleges that Multiplan has been colluding with all these payers to form a cartel to fix prices for out-of-network healthcare, and that Multiplan actually has been passing information amongst the payers, using other tactics to depress reimbursement rates in the market for out-of-network healthcare in the United States. So I am on the executive committee for the direct action plaintiffs in this case. There's other attorneys in this room who are on the class part of that case, and it's just kind of in its infancy. There's a master complaint that was recently filed, but that is a case which impacts pretty much every single healthcare provider in this country who has provided any healthcare services on an out-of-network basis over the past few years. Because what we allege in that case is that they're not being paid fair, that they're not being paid according to the market, but that instead, Multiplan is working with the payers to reduce the prices paid for out-of-network services and lining its own pockets. So,
and I want to come back to the litigation issue in a second. Dr. Mass, do you have any do you deal with the Multiplans of the world, the just pricing games, the payment games? Does this sound familiar to you?
It's familiar to me because I made myself aware of it, because I sort of feel like almost everything in healthcare, everyone's up in everyone else's business, right? We have this vertical integration and they're all connected. Me, myself, I'm actually an employed physician. You may be shocked to find that out, right? Who knows for how long that will last with some of the things that I like to say about transparency. But in any case, I don't have to deal with it myself, but I kind of also see it from the patient side. There's a really wonderful podcast about this on An Arm and a Leg. They did a fantastic job of laying it out. And the thing that I remember most about it is there was a case in which the patient, they were told that they saved $80,000. So they, on the amount of claim that they owed because they were out of network, that Multiplan and the insurer worked together and saved them $80,000. But then they were responsible for, I guess, paying a portion of that. I think they paid 50 to Multiplan and the insurer, and then the person who provided the actual care, or the hospital that provided the actual care, got $8,000. So, like, when you think about those numbers, something's really wrong. Patient needs care, person can provide care. Here's a group over here, and they're probably perversely incentivized to somehow pump up the cost of what the care was, so that that delta that you talked about is bigger, because that's where they're making the money. So, did I say that right?
Sounds a lot
You're-
like
that's
PBMs.
Terrible.
Matt,
Profiting on the sick.
Well,
Yeah.
the
Go ahead.
doctor's absolutely correct, is that many times the fee that Multiplan, the insurance companies, collect when they underprice a claim is many times what the provider is paid in those instances. To a shocking, sometimes I've seen 10 times as much. So, these illusory discounts and savings in healthcare, they're really going to the insurance companies and companies like Multiplan, other middlemen, and they don't show up as premiums because they're extra fees. So, they're a hidden fee that nobody really sees. And it's a fee that's usually paid by the employer health plan. I know I'm on the benefits committee for my law firm, for example. And every month or whatever, we get the bills for running our health plan, and there's always a line item on there that says shared savings on the bills that come in. The shared saving, I am not sharing in that savings because we are paying that bill every month, but it's it's millions of dollars, and these are the fees. They're not itemized by claim or line amount, and that's not just, it's any employee. And I've been involved in a lot of cases involving this. There is no transparency as to where that money's going, because they don't want people to know about it.
I want to say on the risk for a second, because Multiplan was a very, very large company. I want to say they've lost about like at least 10 billion on their market cap, or 5 billion. I mean, it's just a market cap is just.
They had a reverse stock split recently.
Okay.
So what happened was, in April, the New York Times came out with an expose, a reporter named Chris Hamby, on Multiplan, and not only the things that I'm talking about, but also how it impacts patients and access to care, and how in some cases patients were stuck with a bill for that balance between the doctor's original amount and the Multiplan replaced amount. But even when they weren't, it impacts the ability of healthcare providers to accept those patients and to deal with patients on an out-of-network basis, which limits options. Even though somebody may pay a lot of money I know I pay a lot of money for my family for a PPO plan, so they have options and out-of-network options. In many ways, those can be worthless benefits that I'm paying for, because there's a lot of doctors who won't do it. The New York Times came out with an article in April, and soon after that, Senator Amy Klobuchar held hearings in the Senate on Multiplan and asked the Department of Justice to launch an investigation, and they did launch an investigation, is my understanding. And not long after, the Senate Help Committee, led by Bernie Sanders, also got involved and wrote to the Department of Labor and asked them to investigate Multiplan. And the House Committee on Labor and the Workforce also got involved. So there's a lot of pressure right now on Multiplan. And as a result of that, just within the last 4 or 5 months, Multiplan has a new CEO, a new chief legal officer, a new chief financial officer. Their stock traded at under $1 for a couple months. They got delisting letters from the New York Stock Exchange, and they've done a reverse stock split. So I think they've got plans to alter their business model, possibly in light of litigation and other pressures they're facing. But their impact upon the entire healthcare world is still felt. It's still a significant impediment to people receiving care.
One thing I think is funny though, and then we can move on from Multiplan for a little bit. The health insurers have the same litigation risk in many respects. They're alleged to have colluded with Multiplan. United Health in particular has its own in-house competitor effectively to Multiplan called Navigard. But you haven't seen I mean, you know, you've obviously seen some people be upset with United Health, but you haven't seen the same level of sort of appreciation of litigation risk, I feel like, with United Health and the other insurers. Do you see, is that just a matter of time before we sort of have everyone wake up to the insurers, the payers actually having similar, problematic exposure?
The previous panel mentioned it. I think, for somebody like United Healthcare with, $400 billion a year in revenue for United Health Group, litigation, even if it's a massive judgment, is not always a huge needle mover for them, because they have such vast resources. They're the fourth largest company in the United States of America. And, there's Apple, there's Microsoft, and there's Alphabet, and then there's United Healthcare. And so I think for them, and United Healthcare is involved in hundreds of suits all over the country. I am an attorney in many of those suits. But I think, for somebody like Multiplan, it becomes like a stigma to be associated with Multiplan when you got enough problems of your own. But when, if I'm going to be involved with Multiplan, I'm putting a target on my back. I think that's a reality that's out there.
Let's talk about, we've got Multiplan. This is the president has said, President Trump, incoming President Trump has said he has an issue with PBMs and ostensibly other middlemen. Let's talk about another one that is also under investigation, at least at the FTC, GPOs, Philip, I'd imagine you have some expertise here, and anyone feel free to jump in after Philip. But the role of GPOs and anything else that you want to talk about in terms of middlemen that are at the center of drug shortages, GPOs and maybe wholesalers. How you see the drug shortage issue? It does come up a lot now. I listened to a podcast recently where they were just reading off a list of drugs that are listed on the FDA's website that are in shortage. It was extremely long lists. What's your take on middlemen and the role that they play in the drug shortage, crisis in the country right now?
Thanks for having me. First of all, might help to give you some background as to how I got involved with this. I'm a journalist. I'm not a pharmacist, a doctor, a lawyer, any of that kind of stuff. I stumbled on this story when I was a finance editor at Business Week in the mid to late 90s. I was sitting down. I was in Oklahoma to give a speech on banking. I covered banking, finance, and Wall Street, and wrote a book and broke a story on a bank scandal that originated in Oklahoma City that caused the collapse of a bunch of major banks. And every 5 years or so, I'd get invited to talk to bankers or people in Oklahoma City about the lessons learned from this debacle. And I called up a friend, a former United States attorney, Bill Price, who had prosecuted the first criminal case unsuccessfully as it happened. And we're just sitting around over breakfast talking. I said, Bill, you have any interesting cases that might make a good story for Business Week? And immediately he launches into this story about a client called Retractable Technologies that had invented this remarkable revolutionary syringe that prevents needle stick accidents. I knew nothing about any of this. And he had gotten an NIH grant to develop it, got FDA approval, had shown it around to bankers, to doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers, and they loved it. And then he found around 1996 he couldn't sell it. And Bill starts telling me about these cartels called group purchasing organizations that were blocking his client from getting into this marketplace. And I thought that was pretty interesting. If it weren't for my confidence in the former United States attorney, I might have just not bothered with it. But this fellow is so credible that I pursued it, found many other small companies that with better, safer, cheaper, innovative products that had the same experience, and teamed up with another one of our writers to do a story called Locked Out of the Hospital. And by the way, these are old. I'm not sure that the silicone that it's dried out, but I'll take a chance. This is the way it worked. You give an injection and you push the plunger in and the needle retracts automatically. And the dominant supplier, the monopolist, was Becton Dickinson, and they controlled the market. And we found that, as I said, many other small companies were affected by this, and spent 6 weeks vetting some of the other companies and produced this story. And about 18 months later, the CEO of this company asked me if I would consider taking a sabbatical from journalism to try to reform the system. And I had lunch over sushi with a buddy of mine from my Wall Street Journal days. He was then with 60 Minutes, and he said, mainly to ask if this was a good career move, going over to the dark side, as we say. And he thought it was, and got more interested in the story. And I took the job, and we immediately started working on a segment called Needles with Mike Wallace. And Senator Leahy, his wife is a nurse, and they were watching, as the story goes, they were watching this segment where my new boss was interviewed, and Becton Dickinson was lambasted. And what happened was, as I said, Leahy's wife was I guess still is a nurse, and she was watching this segment. They were watching it together. And supposedly she said, Patrick, you got to do something about this. And Senator Leahy at the time was chairman of between assignments as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and a member of Senate Antitrust. He put it on the agenda, and the result was 4 hearings before the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, and exposing all kinds of abuses. I'll never forget, Senator Cole and DeWine were at various times chairman and ranking member of the committee. And at the time of the first hearing, Senator Cole opens the hearing by telling a story about a patient who was lying on the operating table, had not yet been anesthetized, waiting for a pacemaker to be installed. And suddenly the doctors were informed, well, that pacemaker's not on the GPO contract. So they had to cancel the surgery and take him to a hospital where that preferred pacemaker was on the contract. I mean, it's just filled with crazy stuff. This was the 2003 hearing where you might have heard about the contrast dye shortage, when during the pandemic, the plant that was primary plant for making contrast dye was in Shanghai, and it got shut down because of the pandemic. And So there was a worldwide shortage of this essential diagnostic tool. But in 2003, an executive of Bracco Diagnostics, an Italian company that made perfectly good contrast dye, wrote an 11-page letter to the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee complaining that a company called Novation, which is now called Vizient, the largest GPO, wouldn't put them on contract. And probably because of this letter, they got on contract, so there was at least some production of contrast dye in 2021, 22. Just to go back to the origin of this, our supply chain is a legalized fraud. There's no other way to put it. In 1987, or I go back to 1910, a bunch of hospitals in New York, including Bellevue, down the street from me, came up with the idea of banding together and forming kind of a co-op to buy supplies in bulk and reduce supply prices. And that worked fine for almost 80 years. And I don't know if any of you here remember Bert Lance, who famously said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Well, these guys busted the whole supply chain. They got Congress to tack on an amendment to the Social Security Act that provided a safe harbor for GPOs to accept kickbacks from suppliers, bribes. And that changed the whole economics of this business from one that everybody saved money by buying in bulk to one where profit was the driving force. And just to fast forward here, a number of companies, including a company called Massimo, the CEO became sort of the poster boy for this. He later became a billionaire when his product was able to get into the market because he appeared on page 1 of the New York Times, testified before Congress, and filed an antitrust case. And at the first hearing where he testified, they had hauled the heads of the two largest GPOs, what was then Novation and now Vizient and Premier, which is a public company. They turned around in the hearing room and offered him contracts. So basically, people who have appeared on page 1 of the New York Times or testified before Congress or filed a lawsuit have been able to get into the market. But it shouldn't be that way. And Senator Cole and DeWine in 2005, they drafted a bill called the that basically repealed would have repealed the safe harbor. It's called the Ensuring Competition and Hospital Purchasing Act. And it would have ended the bribes and kickbacks and all this kind of stuff. But the business model for the post safe harbor supply chain was they literally sold sole source contracts and at exorbitant fees. There was basically no limitation. There was what we called a soft cap on fees of 3%, but administrative fees. But to get around that or to sort of disguise that, they invented other fees. They invented advance fees, marketing fees, conversion fees, every fee you can imagine. And in some instances, in one instance, the fees on one drug from one company called Diltiazem, a company called Benvenue, they basically put this company out of business, was 56.25% of their total annual revenue for that drug. So basically, the middlemen run the show. They set the prices, and they have a major lobbying operation. They are very good at that, very slick. And when I published, I teamed up. I didn't know about this crisis and this drug shortage crisis until President Obama issued an executive order to the FDA to address the problem. And it took me like 2 minutes to realize that while I wasn't aware of the drug shortage crisis, I know who caused it. And I immediately start Googling, and I found a woman who was a consultant, drug distribution consultant in Ohio, and we teamed up and put together a white paper that we just threw up on the web explaining how this whole corrupt system worked. And I had heard from a Canadian oncologist who has a website on drug shortages. This is a worldwide problem caused by 3 big monopolists in the United States that's reverberated worldwide. And we teamed up and did this white paper on connecting the dots. And it got quite a lot of circulation. That in 2012, I heard that there was a guy, a doctor at Emory, who was organizing a conference to discuss the ethics of rationing drugs in a time of shortage. And I call him up. I said, Doctor, I left a voicemail. Doctor, you really ought to take a look at the underlying questionable ethics that created this problem in the first place. And he calls me back the next day. He says, you got my attention. This guy knew nothing about government. He's from Canada. Knew nothing about government, knew nothing about economics, never heard of Adam Smith, knew nothing about supply chains. All he knew is he couldn't get propofol and succinylcholine and all these drugs that anesthesiologists use to put their patients to sleep. And the ASA, American Society of Anesthesiologists, had a annual meeting in Washington that October 2012, and they had a panel on drug shortages. And this gets to another point that the leadership of the ASA and the FDA were there and gave this presentation on drug shortages. And the head of the drug shortage program at the FDA was there. She's an officer in the Public Health Service. And they're basically telling this group, well, the problem is complex and multifactorial. And during the Q&A, Dr. Zivit jumps out of his chair. I was sitting next to him. And he said, you're giving us nothing but bullshit. There is a cause and there is a solution. And a bunch of people gathered around and we formed our group, Physicians Against Drug Shortages, and been hammering away at this ever since. Congress has been useless. There were members of Congress had face-to-face meetings in the last 12 years with 25 United States senators.
And Phil,
And they don't want any part of this.
There is an FTC investigation.
Huh?
The FTC is looking into this, but I want to make sure we get to all the panelists here. So
Yeah, I'm sorry.
we've got the GPOs, we've got Multiplan. I want to get the physician perspective in one moment. First, I want to ask Misha, from your perspective, running a big health plan, what is it like dealing with middlemen? I'm not sure exactly which specific ones you can talk about, but I imagine it can be a frustrating experience. Would love to get your perspective as someone who manages a lot of healthcare for a lot of members of your health fund.
Yep. So for context, for those who aren't aware, 32BJ Health Fund is a self-insured Taft-Hartley fund. Primarily in the New York area, we cover about 200,000 32BJ SEIU union members and their families, and those are doormen, porters, janitors, the people that serve your food in schools. So we fund our benefits directly from contributions from about 5,000 employers, and those are small businesses up to global real estate firms. So every dollar that the union and the employers are negotiating over at the table is, about 40% of it goes to healthcare, but that used to be about 17% going to healthcare out of the total compensation package. We provide about $1.5 billion in healthcare each year. Over half of that goes to hospital costs. Only about 5% of that goes to our technical administrative fee to our third-party administrator, which is an Anthem local. But what you don't see outside of that administration fee are, I think, some of the spread pricing that you've seen for a long time in the PBM industry, but now are starting to see on the medical side as well. So we talked about it with Multiplan. What we see in our claims data, we receive all of our claims data, and we see our utilization stay pretty stable or go down, and we see our prices continue to go up. But I do think you also see less being paid out to the provider, some pretty suspicious looking claims data in terms of where certain line items are going and certain fees. There's also that element of, like you talked about, shared savings, which is on our side, they say, we don't have any shared savings programs, but you keep getting hit up over and over again for claims that are being audited. When we get that money back through the claims auditing process, we're going to take a cut of that and call it shared savings when we probably shouldn't have paid it in the first place. So we're paying more money into the subsidiaries that are located inside of the big BUCA plans for really the job that they should be doing in the first place and what we're paying for already. So that is a lot of how we experience middlemen. I think we also experience a lot of contracts that we aren't privy to, but that affect our members greatly. So the contracts that our third-party administrator, Anthem, holds with providers, especially the providers with market power, or the 5 largest systems in New York City, they are forming contracts together that affect how our members experience care and affect where our dollars go. But we have no visibility into those contracts, and we really have little to say over those contracts. In our most recent procurement process, we tried to ask for more visibility, and we did get more of a survey on what some of those contracts might hold in terms of anti-competitive contracting clauses or exemptions to really standard quality measures like the ones used in HRRP. And so I think what's needed for us is both regulation and enforcement, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that. That's how we experience it.
Yeah, I want to stay on this for 1 second because as a small employer, I am deeply envious that you actually get access to any of this information at all. I get absolutely zero. I get a strong stiff arm when I ask for any claims data. But I want to stay on this before we get to Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Mass. What would government enforcement, government regulation look like that would benefit your members? I mean, a lot of this is playing out through litigation, private litigation. We talked about that ERISA litigation earlier in the day. We could talk about myriad types of private litigation. Obviously Matt is engaged in a lot of litigation when it comes to these middlemen on the provider side. But from your standpoint, for you to have a successful, for you to have a system that works for your members, what would you like to see? What do you think needs to be done. We mentioned getting rid of kickbacks. I mean, that seems like a big theme. But what would you like to see? What do you think would be lead to success for you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the underlying foundation of ERISA is holding plan fiduciaries responsible for every dollar that you're spending for your members, whether it be health benefits over things like wages and other benefits. We take that very seriously, but we have a really hard time having our middlemen, third-party administrators or others, also take that seriously. So having an extension of, I think, the concept of a fiduciary, not only from the plan sponsor, it's very important for that plan sponsor to have that fiduciary responsibility, but it's also really important for these third-party administrators to hold that fiduciary responsibility as well.
Matt,
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you make. And, those third-party administrators, to the extent they're given discretion over claims, are also fiduciaries to the extent they're exercising discretion. One of the biggest problems with ERISA and ERISA enforcement is that the Department of Labor, which is responsible for enforcing ERISA, has no statutory authority to fine anybody. The worst it can do is come in, spend a year or two investigating something, maybe longer, lots of resources, lots of people, and then find out, yeah, you know what, you should have done differently on that claim. And now here's the injunctive order to do that, pay what you should have paid the first time, or take whatever action you should have paid that, which is not a deterrent, right? It's not a deterrent because they're going to do that 100 times and they're going to get caught twice. And twice they're going to have to do what they should have done. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's a big thing, is to have more.
But the lawsuit saying, "Hey, you are."
So lawsuits are
ignoring
great,
yeah.
but there's only so many lawyers out there, and you've got to have like the time. First of all, it's expensive to hire an ERISA lawyer to go do that. If you find a risk, there's got to be a lot of money involved in it to get a lawyer to take it that you're not paying money to up front. And what I see all day long. And I represent all sorts of clients. There's some clients who represent on a contingent basis, but I got a lot of clients that I represent on just an hourly basis. And for them to be able to come and afford to be able to hire me to go after, or anybody, to spend our time going after an insurance company or a middleman or a TPA for ERISA violations is a long and expensive process. And if you were, especially other organizations, it's hard to make that commitment to go do that. And the TPAs know that, right? And they know that very few are actually going to invest the time and the financial resources in holding them accountable.
And I just want to say with Misha for one more second, any other things that you want to see besides that extension of the fiduciary responsibility?
I should add that the GPOs extort kickbacks from the suppliers, and effectively by selling sole source contracts, that they anoint dominant suppliers as monopolies. And in addition to being a monopsony themselves, they create all these other monopolies of large dominant suppliers like Baxter Healthcare, Becton Dickinson, and so on. But what few people don't appreciate is that a portion of that money then gets paid to the CEOs of large shareholder hospitals. Premier Innovation, they are owned by big hospitals. The academic medical centers, Yale, Hopkins, and so forth, most of them belong to this outfit called Vizient. And others belong to Premier, which incredibly was permitted to go public in 2013.
I'm intimately familiar with that. Yeah, my father was a lobbyist, helped make that happen. Unfortunately, it got a lot to live down. But let's go. I want to stay with Misha for 1 second. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would also add, I think it would be great on the federal level to see a ban on anti-competitive contracting clauses. You've seen it play out in many states. We tried ourselves with a bill banning 4 of the big anti-competitive contracting clauses between TPAs and hospital systems. We were only successful at banning, 2 of them, most favored nation provisions and gag clauses, which are already banned at the federal level. But ban on most favored nation provisions, ban on, anti-tiering, anti-steering, or all or nothing clauses, things that really protect some of the must-have systems and leave you with no choice in terms of benefit design are things that we would love to see banned at the federal level instead of having to push for it in each individual state.
And I want to turn to the people on the ground, Dr. Fernandez, Dr. Mass. Dr. Fernandez, I know you, we talked a lot about private equity the last time you were here last year. I'm wondering, it's kind of hard to call them necessarily a middleman. They're sort of a financial intermediary. I guess they're a middleman at some level. But wanted to get your take just overall. You're dealing with middlemen in the system, getting in between you, delivering care for your patients, whether it's financial conglomerates like private equity or anyone else. Want to hear from you, your perspective.
So I am a full-time cardiac anesthesiologist. I still practice. I'm the president of the Association for Independent Medicine, and I'm also one of the co-founders for the Coalition for Patient-Centered Care. We're trying to align with consumer protection groups to protect patients and physicians from private equity. I had my own entanglement with private equity. We lost. We're the largest independent group in Illinois. We are half the size now than we were before the pandemic. We lost a couple of groups to private equity. Talk about competition. Today it's good that we talk about it, but when private equity comes around, at least for anesthesia, there is no competition. They come in, they work deals behind closed doors with the hospitals, and then they take your contract, and then you have to decide if you're going to stay or go. That happened to us twice within a 2-week period in August of 2021. We lost one to North Star. We lost another one to Team Health. Now, the funny thing about it was the person who spearheaded the takeover of my contract at Team Health was also the executive board member from my national society, the American Society of Anesthesiologists, which is why we actually got together and formed this association. I did go to the society and I did tell them, our practices are being eviscerated by private equity across the country. And their response was they needed to remain agnostic. And there is investment by multiple private equity staffing firms in our societies, which I think makes it really hard for them to take a stand. But I think grassroots groups like mine and Dr. Mass's and Take Medicine Back and Physicians for Protecting Patients, we're all working together to try to make sure that we maintain that patient-physician relationship. It's getting harder and harder now that almost 80% of us are almost employed. We don't know what faction of that is private equity. But what I do know is that more folks are starting to get unionized. And for me, it's sad to see a highly educated profession, now their only hope for protection is getting unionized. I believe in organizing, but I think it's a long slide from losing your independence and your autonomy to actually getting unionized, and the ones who actually suffer are the patients. Because when you lose your independence, usually what happens, whether you get employed by a hospital or private equity or even Optum, because they have an anesthesia arm, sound anesthesia, they all behave the same way. They don't want to pay the physician. They say efficiencies, but they want to figure out a way to extract profits from your group. And the way they do that is they change your model of care, and they either add a bunch of non-physicians or they replace the physicians with certified nurse anesthetists. I'm all for the team care approach, but I was at my hospital for 22 years, and they didn't want to give us a subsidy, so they tried to replace us, and we had a long-standing relationship in the hospital with the community, and we did provide what I thought was high-quality care. None of that matters anymore. The only thing that matters is the bottom line. Those relationships are gone, but you need those relationships to create cultures of safety. You need trust and respect. Now you just have a revolving door of temporary workers every time someone thinks about trying to save money, and anesthesia is the low-hanging fruit. You saw that with Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shields recently. In June, they decided they were no longer going to pay for complexity of our cases. They were no longer going to look at the physical status of the patients. We have a way that we categorize complexity in a patient, and it takes a little more time and effort, and there's just one modifier that they decided they're no longer going to pay, and it's in 5 different states. Blue Cross Blue Shield covers 8 million out of 11 million people in Illinois. And we talked to them and we said, what are you going to do with this money that is not going to be paid to anesthesiologists anymore? Is it going to go to the patient? They said, we can't guarantee that. And you saw more recently, they were going to start looking at arbitrary times for anesthesia times. And they kind of backtracked with the recent incident with, I believe, with United Healthcare. But I think insurance companies are going to continue to push the envelope in terms of what they are willing to pay for and see what they can get away with. And I think that physicians really need to come together, all grassroots groups, all the legacy groups really need to organize and really push back. I know that we want enforcement, we want legislation, we want transparency, we want research. All of that takes time, and patients are suffering today. So I think I tell my colleagues, no one's going to save us. We need to do more for our patients. We need to invest in advocacy, and we need to work with everyone around us. We're patients on the other side of this. I felt it, I've seen it, and maybe we can talk about it with a little bourbon afterwards, but it's not anything that I would wish on anyone else. So it's become my burning platform.
I want to ask Dr. Matz as well, and then I want to get back to this corporate practice of medicine, which I think seems like a state level, local level movement. But Dr. Matz, what are you seeing? What are the biggest issues for you from your standpoint? Whether it's private equity, whether it's other middlemen, what are you seeing being
from the 18,000 mile high view, we are all paying more and we're all getting less. So I'm going to concentrate for a minute on the getting less, because my patients come in and they say, it took me a long time to get in here. I can't get into my regular primary care doctor. I do urgent care. Then I have to expose them to the problems that we've had over the past several years with shortages. We've had shortages of formula. We've had shortages of basic antibiotics, which has actually now led us to using other antibiotics, and now we have a resistance problem. We now have a shortage of saline. I mean, we're surrounded on how many sides by salt water, and we don't have saline in hospitals. And some of this refers back to what Phil was talking about, but I want to pull in another layer. So we have a shortage of transparency, and we have a shortage of transparency of conflicts of interest. It's been great hearing about all of the PBM layers and the insurance layers of the vertical integration, but there's other vertical integration that's really hard to find and hard to see. So on the list for today in our panel was talking about other middlemen, including McKesson, who is a big distributor. So when Phil's talking about the group purchasing organizations, please realize these are not people that are making product, doing any research, or even moving the product around. They're just writing the contracts like a bunch of bookies, right? So the distributors are the people that are actually moving the product around. So they're actually, doing a good service, or doing a service that's very needed, but they're also, just like everything else in healthcare, very highly consolidated. There's 3 companies that are running most of what turns out to be an $800 billion market, and it's very heavy into pharmaceuticals. A third of the end use comes into hospital drugs, and a half comes into outpatient pharmaceutical drugs. So you have your 3 big ones. You have Cencora, the company formerly known as AmerisourceBergen, because they just changed their name, which to me is always like a little bat signal that you must have done something bad somewhere. So you have the Cencora that changed their name, and then you have Cardinal, and you have McKesson, and there's these 3 big distributors. And I also think we have to look at little signals that tell us that it must be really, really hard. There must be some kind of secret club between them and the GPOs who write the contracts to get into the hospitals, and then the hospitals themselves, and even the manufacturers. How do we know? Well, Amazon tried PillPack and they failed. Amazon, with all of the money and power that they have, can't break into the distribution market. What does that tell us? it tells me I'd want to hear from like the little distributors. So I hope in moving into this next administration, a new Congress, a new Senate, the whole 9 yards, I'd really like to hear a lot about that and why it's so hard to break into the market. Are there small distributors that tried? Is there an excess of money that we're all paying? I mean, my gosh, in some hospitals, up to 40% of the overhead is in supplies. I sure want to know. I hope y'all do too. I'll add the other part that there's a lot of vertical integration. And there's a lot of like cross dealing. For instance, Vizient, the big company that Phil mentioned, they had this little arm called Apexis. Well, guess what? HRSA gave them the, exclusive contract. They get to negotiate the 340B drugs between the 340B sites and the manufacturers. How convenient is that? We just got over hearing that the GPOs who can collect kickbacks have been given, their arm is given an exclusive government contract. This is outrageous. McKesson and Cardinal, Elizabeth Warren wrote a letter, I believe it was in September, talking about the new integration that both McKesson and Cardinal were trying to do with management service organizations that are running big oncology groups. In the panel before this, we heard about expensive oncology drugs. We certainly know those oncology drugs make a lot of money for 340B. So now we have practices involved. McKesson already owned US Oncology. I mean, that's a lot of oncology practices. And now I'm going to drift back down to earth and put myself in the shoes of my patient, which is where I live every day when I close the exam room door and I turn to my patient, because they just want to know that they're getting care, suggestions, diagnosis that they trust. They want to know that if they need a medication, that it's there, that if they go into the hospital, that they can get the care that they need. Well, what do I do for my patient that's sick as snot with pneumonia, that's barely able to drink, and I have to try to jerry-rig some way that she doesn't end up in the hospital because she's not going to get IV fluids because they don't have them anyway, and maybe she won't be able to get antibiotics. And I'm supposed to say that I work in the best medical system in the world? Something's really wrong. And the more we have all of this vertical integration and this insidious backdealing and government granted rights for kickbacks and for, exclusive deals to be able to negotiate in the second biggest drug program in the entire United States, because that's what 340B is, the less I trust. How can I ask my patient to trust? So I guess I'm very hopeful. Sorry to take so much time.
No, this is fabulous.
But, I'm very hopeful in moving forward that at least with the GPO issue, we can start looking under the hood. I made a comment for Capitol Forum last week in their newsletter. Several years ago, I believe Phil also talked to Dr. Marty McCary, and I know I did. He wrote a really terrific article in JAMA describing the GPOs. Hopefully he's coming on as the FDA. If you ask me, I think he looks like the shoe-in candidate from all that were in the healthcare sector. But I actually talked to the outgoing FDA chair at my Duke reunion. And I mean, I wasn't told that I wasn't able to say this, but he very clearly outlined what Phil said a couple minutes ago about the dealings between the hospital systems and the GPOs. So he stood up on a stage with the head of all of Duke Medicine in front of 120 Duke grads. And when I asked the question about the shortages, he outlined the GPOs, and then he told us the GPOs have all kinds of financial arrangements with the big hospital systems. The Duke person next to him was squirming. The people were very interested. But he pointed out that the hospital systems are going to have to maybe stop having the financial arrangements that allow them to build bigger and bigger Taj Mahals and come to a reckoning that we can't keep going in this direction, or we're going to have the congressional oversight. So I guess, I'd like to have I don't want any more shortages of transparency. I want to have transparency of conflicts of interest. I want to have it of these contracts of who's spending what and who's paying whom. And I think that maybe that will end us in a position where physicians like Marco and I don't have to play MacGyver in a system that's short on everything, and that maybe we'll have the tools to take care of our patients.
I want to ask one, open up one question to the audience, and I want to ask one last question for Marco related to corporate practice of medicine. What was this is a movement that you're at the center of, or you're involved in, at the state, it's a state level, state by state municipality by municipality, local level issue. How is that going? And I'm curious, we asked earlier, Congressman Carter, what the political congressional reaction to the United Health executive assassination and the public reaction to that, which was really dramatic and unexpected, at least from my perspective. Does that get at the concern that big corporations are making personal medical decisions for people? And is that something that have you felt anything since then, in terms of your movement, or, what's your reaction to that? And what's the current state of the corporate practice of medicine movement now, just, past since the year that we last saw you?
So the past year, there's been a lot of bills coming in different states. There was one in Oregon that Hayden Rookley, he's back there. He was a big part of that, and he helped the physicians. We testified. We gave virtual testimony. We wrote in. It was a huge response and support of trying to pass and close loopholes for private equity. But I think at the ninth hour, private equity, came in with their lobbyists and their lawyers, and they couldn't get it to pass. We're going to revisit that again. We're going to help the representative Oregon revisit that. In California, we worked on a bill there, and it passed the House, the state Senate, the state House, and then Governor Newsom nixed it last minute. We're going to revisit that. So there's a lot of momentum, and also with what recently happened in Massachusetts with this whole Steward thing. It looks like Optum's going to buy them out. But I think it's a tragedy what happened to the healthcare executive. But I think the attention is definitely going to help any movement that's going to work on transparency, accountability in the healthcare system. And we're going to try to support any calls to action in any state. We're in constant contact with all the grassroots groups, and we're also making headway within the large organizations. We're finding like-minded folks within my national society, within the AMA, and we're going to continue to push. This isn't going to go away. And like I said earlier, at the end of the day, we're all patients in all of this.
One question from the audience, and then we will head to the bar at Hamilton for drinks. No questions. I'm surprised. No, we got one question. One very bold person here in the front, Alice.
So I think earlier the USAP lawsuit was mentioned. So the FTC sued an anesthesia staffing group in Texas for allegedly rolling up the market. And as was mentioned earlier, that case has survived against USAP, survived the motion to dismiss. But one thing I thought was interesting is I don't think it survived the motion to dismiss against the private equity backer. Welsh Carson survived, and part of the reasoning was that they simply weren't involved with the staffing group long enough, right? Because the private equity business model is to kind of invest for a short amount of time, make money, and then leave. And that, in my from my reading of it, kind of quashed the FTC's ability to really include the private equity backer in that lawsuit. And, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I guess from your perspective, Dr. Fernandez, what does that tell us about sort of the slipperiness of private equity, the difficulty of sort of regulating that particular industry? And does it give us any clues into like how we should be, attacking it better or finding other ways to come at private equity medicine?
I mean, I think the biggest piece in the FTC launching the lawsuit was that it really shed light on what private equity was doing for or with anesthesia. And I think they take a little bit of a different approach depending on your specialty. For us that are hospital-based, non-proceduralists, they come in and roll you up. You're squeezed and sold. For those proceduralist surgeons, their approach is to buy and build. So they come in and they'll give you the group a price and then maybe buy the ancillary services, and that's how they make their money. So they may not be so quick to flip. But with anesthesia, we have no ancillary services. We don't bring patients to the hospital. But I think that just shedding light on it, and recently the UFC just released a working paper on specifically USAP went into a lot of detail of how they actually colluded in that market, and I think it's happening everywhere. But I think it's going to make it easier for us to have those discussions and talk to legislators, and then at the state level try to figure out what are the pressure points. And there's already doctrines in 34 states. Let's enforce some of those, because it's hard to write the legislation in a state that doesn't have it, but at least in the ones that do, and then hopefully that'll break the ice for other states, and then maybe we can talk about a federal ban on the corporate practice of medicine.
Thank you so much. This panel could have been, we could have done a separate panel on each of these topics. Thank you so much for doing this.
Next year.
And this concludes the conference. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We will be heading to the Hamilton for drinks immediately after this. Bye-bye.